happens when a powerful king, weary of palace lies and false flattery, disguises himself as a commoner and wanders into a village market? He discovers something no throne room could ever offer, a truth that changes everything. In a world where a single glance can determine life or death, a humble grape seller with calloused hands catches the eye of a man she doesn't recognize as her ruler. Their forbidden connection, built on genuine moments stolen between two worlds that should never touch, now threatens everything. The whispers begin, accusations spread, and soon the word witch follows her through the village streets. But what is the real enchantment here? The mysterious prosperity of a widow's vineyard? Or the dangerous pull between two souls who found something real in a world built on pretense? As shadows gather and powerful enemies close in, one question remains. In a kingdom where appearance defines reality, what price must be paid for being truly seen? The sharp scent of fear mingled with sweat clung to her skin as Elara arranged the last basket of grapes on her humble wooden stand. Her trembling fingers betrayed what her face struggled to conceal. Yesterday's threat from the tax collector still echoed in her ears, a promise to seize her small vineyard if she couldn't pay her late husband's debts by week's end. She swallowed hard against the knot forming in her throat, knowing that today's sales would determine whether she'd have a roof over her head tomorrow. The marketplace bustled around her, a cacophony of life that only amplified her isolation. Merchants shouted their wares, children darted between stalls, and nobles occasionally passed through with servants carrying their purchases. Elara stood motionless amid the chaos, invisible to most eyes, just another desperate widow selling meager goods. A chill ran down her spine despite the warm autumn air, that peculiar sensation of being watched when no one seemed to notice her at all. Something shifted in the crowd. The usual flow of bodies parted, though not with the customary fanfare that announced nobility. A tall man in simple yet unusually clean clothing moved against the current of peasants. His posture was too straight, his hands too unmarked by labor, yet his eyes, those eyes held something Elara couldn't name. They didn't glance over her as most did. They paused, lingered, saw her. Her heart quickened beneath her worn bodice, an involuntary response that confused her as much as it alarmed her. "Your grapes," he said, his voice carrying an unfamiliar cadence that didn't belong to their region. "They look sweeter than the others." Elara glanced down at her humble offering, seeing only the same sun-kissed fruits she'd harvested at dawn. "They're from the eastern slope, my lord." The honorific slipped out before she could catch it, though she wasn't sure why she'd addressed him so. "The morning light touches them first." The stranger's mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but something that transformed his face briefly. He reached for a cluster, his sleeve pulling back to reveal a thin line of embroidery hidden at the cuff. "May I?" She nodded, suddenly conscious of her dirt-stained apron and calloused hands. As he plucked a single grape and placed it in his mouth, Elara noticed how the crowd had begun to give them space, creating an unnatural circle of emptiness in the packed marketplace. A muscle tensed in her jaw. Something wasn't right. "Exquisite," he murmured, his eyes never leaving her face. "There's a story in this taste. Your vineyard must be special." "It's all I have left, my—" She caught herself again, uncertain. "Sir." His eyes darkened briefly, registering her slip. "And yet you tend it with such care. I can taste the attention in every grape." Behind him, Elara spotted the butcher's son nudging the blacksmith's apprentice, their snickering barely contained as they pointed in her direction. Heat crawled up her neck as she realized they weren't mocking her, but rather the scene unfolding. A man who clearly didn't belong speaking to the village widow as if she mattered. The stranger followed her gaze, his shoulders tensing almost imperceptibly as he observed the growing attention. Something flashed across his features, annoyance perhaps, or concern, before he turned back to her. "I'll take them all," he said quietly. Elara's breath caught in her chest. "All? But sir, that's a fair price for quality." He placed several coins in her palm, the metal warm from being carried close to his body. Her eyes widened at the amount, enough to keep the tax collector at bay for another month at least. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Alara felt a jolt that had nothing to do with the unexpected windfall. The man's hands were smooth yet strong, the hands of someone who had never worked the land or wielded a smith's hammer. Their eyes met again, and in that moment, a terrible understanding dawned on her. This was no ordinary merchant or minor noble. "You should be more careful," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the market's din. "People are watching." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Are they watching me, or you?" The question hung between them, pregnant with implication. Ilara felt her chest tighten as she realized she had no answer. The stranger reached for the smallest bunch of grapes, leaving the rest on her stand. "But I've paid for them all," he said, his voice carrying an unexpected gentleness. "Keep them," she found herself saying. "Sell them again. I suspect you need the coins more than I need the grapes." Something in his expression shifted, a crack in whatever mask he wore. For a heartbeat, Ilara glimpsed vulnerability in those eyes, surprise, perhaps even shame. Then it was gone, replaced by something harder to read. As he turned to leave, a voice cut through the market noise like a blade through silk. "Well, if it isn't the widow with her rotting grapes." The merchant Galen's booming laugh drew every eye in the vicinity. "Found yourself a desperate customer, did you? Or perhaps he pays for more than just fruit." The stranger's back stiffened. His hand moved to his side where, Ilara noticed with growing horror, the outline of a concealed dagger pressed against his simple clothing. She watched his fingers curl into a fist, then slowly release as he visibly fought for control. Without turning back to her, the stranger continued walking, disappearing into the crowd with practiced ease. But Ilara saw how his shoulders remained rigid, how his steps followed a rhythm too measured to be casual. She knew, with certainty that twisted her stomach into knots, that he had heard every word of Galen's taunt. The merchant approached her stand, leaning close enough that she could smell the sour wine on his breath. "Your mysterious admirer seems to have abandoned you rather quickly," he sneered. "Just like your husband did." Ilara said nothing, her fingers closing protectively around the coins hidden in her palm. But as the day wore on and she packed her empty baskets to return home, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted in her world. The coins weighed heavily in the pouch at her waist, but it was the memory of those eyes, seeing her when no one else did, that kept her heart racing long after the market had emptied. What she didn't see was the solitary figure watching from the shadows of an alleyway, his fine clothes now partially concealed beneath a rough cloak. She didn't see how his fists clenched white-knuckled at his sides, or how his eyes never left her until she disappeared from view. She didn't know that, as the king returned to his disguised guards waiting beyond the village gates, his mind was filled not with matters of state, but with the dignity of a grape seller whose silent strength had somehow managed to pierce the armor around his heart. 3 days passed, each hour heavier than the last as King Alaric paced the confines of his private chambers. The taste of those grapes, sweet with a hint of tartness, lingered on his tongue like a stubborn memory. But it wasn't the fruit that haunted him. It was her eyes, downcast yet dignified, a silent defiance against a cruel world that had stripped her of everything but her pride. He stopped at the window, gazing across the castle grounds toward the village, his fingers drumming against the stone ledge. "Your Majesty?" A discreet knock preceded his most trusted servant, Edwin, who entered with the careful movements of someone accustomed to royal moods. "The council awaits your presence regarding the northern border dispute." Alaric didn't turn. "Edwin, how much do you know about the grape harvests in the eastern hills?" The servant's pause was brief but telling. Not much, Your Majesty. The royal vineyards are to the west." "And what of those who aren't royal, the small plots tended by common folk?" Alaric finally faced his servant, noting the confusion in the man's eyes. "I wouldn't know, sire. Such matters rarely concern." "Find out." The king's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I want to know about a vineyard east of the village, small, tended by a widow." He hesitated, realizing he didn't even know her name. "She sells at the market. Dark hair, eyes that—" He stopped himself, aware of how his description was veering toward the personal. Just find out about her circumstances. Edwin's face remained neutral, though a flicker of something, concern perhaps, crossed his features. As you wish, Your Majesty. Shall I postpone the council meeting? No. Tell them I'll be there shortly. Alaric waved him away, returning to his contemplation of the distant village. The following morning, Edwin appeared with the requested information, delivered in the same efficient tone he used for tax reports and military intelligence. The widow's name is Ilara, he began, standing at a respectful distance. Her husband died 2 winters ago. Fever, it seems. They had no children. The vineyard was his family's for 3 generations, but it's struggling now. Without sons or brothers to work the land, she manages alone. Alaric absorbed this, his expression unreadable. And her standing in the village? Here, Edwin's professional demeanor cracked slightly. Difficult, sire. There are rumors. What kind of rumors? Something cold settled in Alaric's chest. The typical sort that follow a young, childless widow. Edwin chose his words carefully. Some say her barrenness was a curse that brought on her husband's death. Others suggest impropriety with travelers, the usual cruel gossip of small communities. Alaric's jaw tightened. He'd heard such whispers all his life, the vicious ways people sought to explain others' misfortunes, to distance themselves from the possibility that tragedy could strike anyone. And the vineyard itself? Small but well situated. The soil there is exceptional. Many have tried to purchase it from her, particularly a merchant named Galen who owns adjacent lands. She's refused all offers despite growing debts. The name struck Alaric like a physical blow. Galen, the same man who had humiliated her in the marketplace. This merchant, he said slowly. Tell me about him. Wealthy by village standards. Controls much of the local grain trade. Not well liked, but feared enough that it hardly matters. Alaric nodded, processing this information against the backdrop of what he'd witnessed. I want grapes from her vineyard served at tonight's banquet. Edwin's composure finally broke. Your Majesty, send someone, discreetly, to purchase them. I want them prominently displayed. But sire, the banquet preparations are already. Then change them. The finality in Alaric's tone left no room for argument. That evening, as nobles and courtiers filled the great hall in a swirl of expensive fabrics and practiced laughter, Alaric sat stone-faced at the head table. Before him, silver platters displayed the finest delicacies from across the kingdom. Roasted pheasant, suckling pig, exotic spices that cost more than most peasants would see in a lifetime. And there, in the center of it all, was a simple earthenware bowl filled with Ilara's grapes. Duchess Lenore, seated to his right, eyed the humble offering with barely concealed disdain. How rustic, she murmured, her painted lips curving into something that resembled a smile but wasn't. Is this a new fashion at court, Your Majesty? Common market fare? The conversation around them dimmed as courtiers strained to hear the king's response. Alaric reached for a grape, rolling it between his fingers before meeting the Duchess's gaze. Tell me, Lady Lenore, when was the last time you tasted something grown by the hands that harvested it? He didn't wait for her answer. These grapes were tended by a widow who works from sunrise to sunset to keep a small piece of land that generations of her husband's family cultivated. While we debate which spice best complements our third course, she wonders if she'll eat it all tomorrow. A uncomfortable silence fell over the nearest tables. The Duchess's smile faltered. I meant no offense, she said quickly. It's simply unusual to see such humble offerings at a royal table. Perhaps that's precisely the problem. Alaric popped the grape into his mouth, savoring its flavor while the courtiers exchanged nervous glances. We've forgotten the taste of honest labor. The music resumed, conversations restarted. But something had shifted in the air. Throughout the meal, Alaric caught snippets of whispered speculation. Some suggested he was making a political point about supporting local agriculture. Others wondered if this sudden interest in common goods signaled new taxes. None guessed the truth, that each grape connected him to a pair of eyes that had seen him not as a king, but as a man. Later that night, after the guests had departed and the castle settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Alaric summoned Edwin again. The widow, Ilara, was she paid fairly for the grapes? Triple the market rate, As you instructed, sire. Alaric nodded, satisfied yet unsettled. And did our messenger mention where they were destined? No, your majesty. We were discreet, as ordered. Good. The king turned away, signaling the end of the conversation, but Edwin remained. If I may, your majesty. The servant rarely offered unsolicited opinions, making his hesitation notable. This interest in a common widow, it has not gone unnoticed among the castle staff. Your point? Alaric's voice cooled. Simply that. Kings are watched more closely than other men, even when they believe themselves unseen. The warning hung in the air between them. Alaric knew what Edwin wasn't saying, that a monarch's curiosity could ruin an innocent woman's life, that his attention was a double-edged sword that could sever as easily as it elevated. I understand your concern, he said finally. But sometimes a grape is just a grape, Edwin. The servant bowed and withdrew, leaving Alaric alone with his thoughts and the knowledge that he had just spoken his first direct lie to his most trusted confidant. Because the truth was far more dangerous than any rumor. In a life surrounded by people trained to anticipate his every need, the king found himself consumed by thoughts of the one woman who had looked at him without recognition or agenda, who had seen him as merely human. Outside the castle walls, in her small cottage at the edge of the vineyard, Alara sat counting the unexpected windfall from her grapes. The coins would keep her land safe for now, but something about the transaction troubled her. The messenger had been polite, almost deferential, paying far too much for produce any peasant could identify as fairly valued. As she tucked the money beneath a loose floorboard, a shiver passed through her that had nothing to do with the evening chill. For the first time since her husband's death, Alara felt the distinct sensation of being part of something larger than her daily struggle to survive, something that both thrilled and terrified her. The market day dawned with a peculiar tension in the air, a heaviness that seemed to press against Alara's skin as she arranged her modest display of grapes. The mysterious orders from an unknown buyer had continued through the week. Each time, the same polite messenger, the same excessive payment, and the same careful avoidance of explaining who wanted her specific harvest. The coins hidden beneath her floorboard had grown to a sum she'd never possessed before, enough to keep her vineyard safe for months. Yet instead of relief, Alara felt exposed, as though she stood on the edge of a precipice she couldn't see. She straightened her back, wincing at the familiar ache. Dawn had found her among the vines, checking for signs of the blight that had ravaged neighboring crops last season. Her hands, cracked and stained purple from yesterday's work, crushing grapes for wine, moved mechanically as she positioned her wares. Around her, the marketplace awakened, the butcher's cleaver creating a steady rhythm against his block, children darting between stalls, the smell of fresh bread and livestock mingling in the crisp morning air. Still peddling those sour fruits, widow? Galen's voice sliced through the ambient noise, setting her teeth on edge. The merchant had made a point of passing her stall daily since that strange encounter with the unknown man. Today he wasn't alone. Two wealthier landowners flanked him, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and disdain. My grapes are as sweet as ever, Galen, she replied, keeping her eyes on her work, though I doubt you've ever bothered to taste them. The merchant's laugh held no warmth. And waste good coin on what's clearly enchanted? Everyone's talking about your mysterious buyer. Some stranger pays triple value for the most ordinary grapes in the kingdom, and you expect us to believe there's no witchcraft involved? One of his companions shifted uncomfortably. Be careful with such accusations, Galen. The church takes a dim view. I'm merely stating facts. Galen cut in, his eyes never leaving Alara. No children from her marriage. Her husband dead within 5 years. And now this sudden prosperity. Draw your own conclusions. Alara's hands stilled. She'd endured years of whispers about her childless state, had weathered the sidelong glances after her husband's death, but this public insinuation of witchcraft sent ice through her veins. Such talk had sent women to the pyre in neighboring villages. Your grapes look exceptional today. The voice, familiar in a way that made her heart skip, came from behind her. Alara turned to find him standing there, the man from before, still in his simple yet too fine clothing. Something in his stance had changed. He carried himself with less concealment today, his gaze direct and unfaltering as it met Galen's. The merchant's face darkened. "Well, if it isn't the widow's champion, returned at last." "I come for the grapes," the stranger said mildly, though something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Their quality is unmatched in the region." "Is that so?" Galen stepped closer, emboldened by his companions. "Strange that no one noticed their exceptional nature until you appeared. What's your name, friend? You're clearly not from our village." "Thomas," the man answered smoothly. Too smoothly, Ilara thought. "I'm a steward from the eastern estates." "Strange," Galen persisted. "I know every estate manager within 3 days' ride. I've never encountered you at the regional markets." A muscle twitched in the stranger's jaw. "I keep to my master's business." "And your master's business includes personally selecting grapes from this specific widow?" Galen's voice had risen enough to draw attention from nearby stalls. Curious indeed. Ilara watched the exchange with growing dread. The crowd was thickening around them, drawn by the prospect of conflict. She saw how the stranger, Thomas, if that was truly his name, repeatedly checked the exits, how his hand occasionally drifted toward his concealed dagger. Whatever game he was playing, Galen was pushing him into a dangerous corner. "My lord appreciates quality," the stranger said, his voice cooling. "As do I." "Your lord," Galen repeated, mockery evident in his tone. "And who might that be?" For the briefest moment, uncertainty crossed the stranger's face, a hesitation so slight Ilara wondered if she'd imagined it. Then he stepped forward, closer to her stall, his back partially to Galen in a deliberate dismissal. "How has your harvest fared this season?" he asked Ilara directly, ignoring the merchant entirely. The shift was so abrupt that Ilara found herself answering before she could think better of it. "Well enough, though the summer drought threatened the younger vines. I've been carrying water from the stream every 3rd day to keep them alive." "By yourself?" There was genuine surprise in his voice. "That's considerable labor for one person." "I manage." She met his gaze, suddenly conscious of how many eyes were watching them. "Though the winters are harder than the summers." His expression softened. "I imagine they would be. The cold seeps deeper when there's no one to share it with." The simple truth of his observation, the first time anyone had acknowledged her loneliness without pity or judgment, caught Ilara off guard. Heat rushed to her cheeks, and she looked down at her calloused hands. "The widow seems quite taken with you, stranger," Galen interjected, his voice sharp with malice. "Perhaps there's more being exchanged here than just grapes and coin." The whispers from the gathering crowd grew louder. Ilara saw familiar faces among them. The blacksmith who'd refused to repair her garden tools without advance payment, the miller's wife who crossed to the other side of the road whenever they met, the priest who had suggested, not unkindly, that perhaps her husband's death was God's judgment on their childless union. "Enough!" The stranger's voice cut through the murmurs with unexpected authority. He turned to face Galen fully, and something in his posture made the merchant take an involuntary step backward. "The lady's grapes are excellent. Her business practices are fair. That should be the end of any discussion." "Lady?" Galen recovered quickly, seizing on the slip. "Our humble widow has certainly risen in station since catching your eye. Tell me, Thomas, do all stewards speak of commoners with such deference?" Ilara saw the trap closing. Whatever this man's true identity, Galen was determined to expose him, and her, to public ridicule or worse. She grabbed a small basket of her finest grapes and thrust it toward the stranger. "Your purchase, sir," she said loudly, firmly. "The same as last week. Please convey my thanks to your master for his continued patronage." Their eyes met over the basket, and in that moment, a silent communication passed between them. He understood what she was doing, giving him an excuse to leave, to end this dangerous confrontation before it escalated further. He nodded almost imperceptibly, reaching for the basket with one hand while placing coins in her palm with the other. Their fingers touched briefly, and Ilara felt that same inexplicable jolt she'd experienced during their first meeting. "My master will be pleased," he said, his voice carrying across the now silent marketplace. "He values quality and integrity above all else." With a final glance at Galen, one that contained a warning even Ilara could read, The stranger departed, moving through the crowd with practiced ease. She watched him go, aware of the weight of the coins in her hand, and the even heavier weight of dozens of stares boring into her. Galen stepped closer, his voice pitched low enough that only she could hear. "Your protector may come and go as he pleases, but you, widow, must live among us every day. Remember that before you rise above your station again?" The threat lingered in the air long after he'd walked away, long after the crowd had dispersed and the market returned to its normal rhythm. As Alara packed her unsold grapes at day's end, her hands trembled not from exhaustion, but from the certainty that something fundamental had shifted in her carefully balanced existence. She had survived these past 2 years by becoming invisible, unremarkable, forgettable. Now whatever game this stranger was playing had made her visible in the most dangerous way possible. And yet, as she walked the lonely path back to her cottage, Alara found herself looking toward the distant castle that crowned the hillside, wondering not who the man truly was, but why. Of all the stalls in the marketplace, of all the widows in the kingdom, his gaze had settled on her. The royal bedchamber felt suffocating despite its cavernous dimensions. King Alaric paced across the ornate carpet, his reflection fragmenting and multiplying in the gilded mirrors that lined the walls. Each face that stared back at him seemed to belong to a different man, the stern ruler, the dutiful son, the lonely widower, none of them reconcilable with the person he'd become in the marketplace. The person Alara knew as Thomas. "Damn it all," he muttered, coming to an abrupt halt before the largest mirror. The confrontation with Galen had been a mistake. He'd allowed himself to be provoked, had nearly revealed his true identity in a moment of anger. Worse, he'd placed Alara in danger by continuing this charade. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. "Enter," he called, composing his features into the mask of royal impassivity his position demanded. Edwin appeared, his face grave. "Your Majesty, Lord Chancellor Harwick requests an immediate audience regarding the northern border negotiations." "At this hour?" "He claims it cannot wait. The emissaries leave at dawn." Alaric sighed. The concerns of state never ceased, even as his mind wandered increasingly to a small vineyard on the eastern hills. "Very well. I'll meet him in the small council chamber." Hours later, as midnight oil burned low in the lamps, Alaric found himself alone again. Treaty documents scattered across his desk. The negotiations had been successful, but the victory felt hollow. He stared at the royal seal pressed into cooling wax, the symbol of his authority, and felt the weight of the crown he wasn't even wearing. Sleep eluded him. Behind closed eyes, he saw Alara's face as Galen had threatened her, the quiet dignity masking genuine fear. She had saved him from exposure today, had given him an exit when his own temper might have betrayed him. And how had he repaid her? By leaving her alone to face the consequences of his selfishness. The thought was unbearable. Dawn found the king slumped in his chair, having reached a decision that both terrified and exhilarated him. He summoned Edwin before the rest of the castle stirred. "I need to return to the village," he stated without preamble. The servant's carefully neutral expression slipped. "Your Majesty, after yesterday's incident, perhaps discretion would be—" "Not in disguise, not as Thomas." Alaric's voice was firm. "As myself." Edwin paled. "Sire, there hasn't been a royal progression to the village in over 7 years. The security arrangements alone would require days of—" "Not a progression. No fanfare, no announcement. Just myself and a small guard. Today. But the protocol can be damned." Alaric cut in, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. "I'm still king, am I not? Or have scrolls and seals and endless meetings reduced me to merely their keeper?" Edwin bowed his head. "Of course, Your Majesty. I'll make the arrangements immediately." Left alone, Alaric walked to the window that faced the village. From this height, the marketplace was a distant patchwork of tiny figures, anonymous and interchangeable. But Alara wasn't there today. It wasn't market day. She would be at her vineyard, working alone, perhaps still shaken from yesterday's confrontation. The realization that he knew her schedule, that he'd memorized which days she sold her wares and which days she tended her vines, sent an uncomfortable ripple through him. When had this fascination begun to consume so much of his attention? She deserved better, he whispered to the empty room. Better than humiliation at Galen's hands. Better than suspicious whispers from neighbors. Better than a king playing at being common while endangering her reputation. The decision solidified in his mind. He would go to her, not as Thomas, but as King Alaric. He would purchase wine from her vineyard for the royal cellars, a legitimate transaction that would place her under royal patronage. The village would see her recognized, respected. She would be protected. And then he would walk away, ending this dangerous game before anyone else could be hurt. By midday, a small retinue departed the castle gates. The king, 6 royal guards, and Edwin, whose disapproving silence spoke volumes. They took the direct road, no longer needing the circuitous paths Alaric had used when traveling in disguise. Villagers stopped and stared as the unexpected procession passed, whispers spreading like wildfire. The vineyard lay just beyond the village proper, a small plot nestled against the eastern hills. As they approached, Alaric saw her, a solitary figure moving between rows of vines, her dark hair tied back, her movements efficient and practiced. She hadn't noticed them yet. "Wait here," he instructed the guards, dismounting from his horse. "Your Majesty," Edwin protested, "protocol dictates—" "Wait, here." The king's tone left no room for argument. As Alaric walked alone toward the vineyard, he felt strangely vulnerable without his disguise. The fine clothes, the signet ring, the sword at his hip, all marked him unmistakably as king, yet he'd never felt less powerful. Each step toward Alara seemed to require more effort than the last. She was inspecting a vine, her back to him, completely absorbed in her work. A sudden breeze carried her voice to him. She was humming, a simple folk melody his own mother had once sung. The unexpected connection made him pause. "Excuse me," he called softly. Alara turned, a greeting clearly forming on her lips for what she assumed was a potential customer. Then recognition dawned, followed immediately by shock. The pruning knife she'd been holding clattered to the ground. She dropped into a deep curtsy, her eyes fixed on the earth. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Seeing her bow before him sent a wave of wrongness through Alaric's chest. This wasn't how she looked at Thomas, with open eyes that saw him, challenged him. The crown between them suddenly felt like an impassable wall. "Rise, please," he said, hating how formal his voice sounded. Alara stood, though her gaze remained lowered. "How may I serve the crown, Your Majesty?" The rehearsed words he'd planned dissolved on his tongue. What could he possibly say now? That he was the man from the marketplace? That he'd deceived her, put her at risk, all for the selfish pleasure of being seen as human rather than royal? "Your grapes," he began awkwardly. "They're quite remarkable. I've heard they make exceptional wine." Her eyes flicked up briefly, confusion evident in them. "You honor my humble vineyard, sire." "The royal cellars are seeking new suppliers," he continued, the lie coming more easily now. "Your reputation has reached the castle." Now she looked directly at him, suspicion replacing confusion. "My reputation, Your Majesty?" The emphasis was slight but unmistakable. Alaric felt heat rise in his face, a sensation he hadn't experienced since boyhood. She was too intelligent not to see through this charade. "For quality," he clarified. "Your grapes are distinctive." A long silence stretched between them. In the distance, Alaric was acutely aware of his guards watching, of Edwin's disapproving presence, of the entire village probably whispering about why the king himself had ridden to a widow's vineyard. Finally, Alara spoke, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands. "Forgive my boldness, sire, but we both know my vineyard has no such reputation. Until recently, no one beyond this village had tasted its fruits." Their eyes met fully now, and in hers, Alaric saw not just recognition, but understanding. She knew, perhaps she had always known. "How long?" he asked quietly. "I suspected at our first meeting," she admitted. "Your hands had never known labor. Your posture, your speech. They told a different story than your clothes." Shame washed over him. "I never meant to deceive you. Didn't you?" There was no accusation in her tone, only a simple question. Before he could answer, a commotion from the road drew their attention. A group of villagers had gathered, pointing and whispering. Among them stood Galen, his expression a mixture of calculation and triumph as he observed the king standing in the widow's vineyard. "Your Majesty," Edwin called, his voice tense with warning. "Perhaps we should continue this business at the castle." Alaric turned back to Alara, suddenly aware that this very public visit had only made things worse. Rather than legitimizing her status, he had ensured that speculation would follow her every move from this day forward. "I've made a terrible mistake," he said softly, for her ears alone. The sad smile that touched her lips held no reproach. "We all play roles we didn't choose, Your Majesty. Some of us simply wear more visible crowns than others." In that moment, faced with her quiet dignity, Alaric realized that the gulf between them was both wider and narrower than he had ever imagined. She understood the constraints of his position better than he did himself. "I would speak with you further," he said, aware that every eye was upon them. "At the castle. Properly, with respect to your position." Ilara's eyes widened slightly, understanding the implications of a royal summons. "As you command, sire." It wasn't what he wanted, not command, not obedience, but with the village watching and whispers already spreading, there was no other way. He had tried to step outside the boundaries of his role, and had only succeeded in drawing her into a dangerous game where she had far more to lose than he ever could. As Alaric turned to leave, the weight of the crown he wasn't wearing pressed down on him more heavily than ever before. The castle's antechamber swallowed Alara in its vastness, making her feel smaller than she had ever been. Tapestries depicting ancient battles covered stone walls that soared upward, disappearing into shadows the afternoon light couldn't reach. Guards stood motionless at every entrance, their eyes fixed straight ahead, seeing everything while acknowledging nothing. Her rough-spun dress, freshly washed but undeniably worn, seemed to absorb the opulence around her, growing shabbier by the moment. 3 days had passed since the king's visit to her vineyard. 3 days of sidelong glances and hushed conversations that ceased when she approached. Even the village priest had stopped by, ostensibly to inquire about her welfare, but clearly fishing for details about the royal encounter. She had revealed nothing, but the damage was done. A summons had arrived that morning, delivered by a royal messenger whose formal tone conveyed the gravity of the command. And so here she stood, awaiting an audience with the man she had known as Thomas. "The king will see you now," announced a steward, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. 2 guards stepped forward to escort her through massive oak doors into the private audience chamber. Unlike the grand throne room where formal court was held, this smaller space served for confidential meetings, though small was a relative term in a castle where even servants' quarters dwarfed her cottage. King Alaric stood near a table laden with maps and scrolls, his back to the door. Without the simple disguise he had worn in the market, his royal bearing was unmistakable. Broad shoulders perfectly aligned, head held at the precise angle that conveyed authority without arrogance. He turned as she entered, and Alara caught the barest flicker of something in his eyes, relief perhaps, or apprehension, before his expression settled into careful neutrality. "Leave us," he commanded the guards, who bowed and retreated, closing the doors with a sound like distant thunder. For several heartbeats, neither spoke. Alara kept her eyes lowered, acutely aware that proper protocol dictated she should curtsy and remain so until given permission to rise. Yet something in her, the same stubborn pride that had kept her working the vineyard alone rather than selling it for a pittance, resisted. She stood straight, hands folded at her waist, neither defiant nor subservient. "You didn't curtsy," he observed finally, his voice softer than she expected. "Would you prefer Thomas or Your Majesty?" The words escaped before she could temper them, and Alara winced internally at her boldness. To her surprise, a smile ghosted across his face. "From you? Perhaps just Alaric, though treason laws might disagree." The unexpected humanity in his response loosened something in Alara's chest. "Then I shall compromise and save us both the headsman's axe. Your Majesty it is." And yet still no curtsy. His tone held no reproach, only curiosity. "I bent my knee to you once by the vines," she replied carefully. "It felt wrong, as though I were acknowledging not your authority, which is your right, but a distance between us that didn't exist when you were Thomas. Alaric moved away from the table, closing the gap between them with slow steps. And what distance existed then? None that mattered. The truth of it struck her as she spoke. You were a man who saw me, and I was a woman seen. Titles seemed insignificant compared to that. He stopped, close enough now that she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of burdens she could only imagine. Is that why you never revealed you knew who I was? Because titles didn't matter? Ilara considered this, wanting to give him honesty rather than what he might wish to hear. No, she said finally. I kept your secret because I sensed you needed to escape. Even kings require freedom sometimes. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability she had glimpsed only in fragments during their marketplace encounters. Freedom is a luxury few understand the value of until it's lost. He gestured toward two chairs positioned near a small hearth. Please sit. This conversation deserves comfort. The request, not command, eased the tension between them. Ilara sank into the chair, its cushioned embrace unlike anything in her humble home. Alaric took the seat opposite, leaning forward with elbows on his knees in a posture too informal for a monarch, but perfectly natural for the man she had known briefly in the market. I owe you an apology, he began, for the disruption my visits have caused in your life. Apologies from kings are rare treasures indeed, she replied, allowing herself a small smile. Though unnecessary, you purchased grapes at fair price, more than fair, truth be told. We both know it wasn't about the grapes. His directness caught her off guard. From the moment I saw you in that marketplace, something changed. Ilara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. Changed how? Alaric ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so human, so at odds with the crown he represented, that Ilara's heart quickened. For years I've been surrounded by people who see only what I represent, not who I am. Advisors who tell me what they think I wish to hear. Nobles who flatter in hopes of favor. Even servants who've known me since childhood treat me as a symbol rather than a man. He paused, seeming to search for words. Then there was you, who looked at me, disguised though I was, with neither fear nor favor. Just honesty. The poor have little room for pretense, she said softly. Hunger and cold strip away such luxuries. Yet many bow and scrape before power, especially when desperate. I tried that path once. The admission slipped out before she could reconsider. After my husband died, I went to the local lord for help with the taxes. He suggested arrangements that would solve my financial troubles in exchange for services of a personal nature. Alaric's expression darkened. Who? It doesn't matter. I refused, left with my dignity intact if not my prospects. She smoothed her skirt, an unconscious gesture to mask discomfort. I learned then that some prices are too high, regardless of how desperate the circumstances. And that day in the market, when I first approached you, I thought perhaps you were another such man, with similar intentions. She met his eyes directly. Until you spoke. There was kindness there, unexpected and genuine. It confused me. A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the occasional crack from the hearth, where a small fire warded off the chamber's perpetual chill. Outside, rain began to fall, its gentle patter against the windows creating a cocoon of intimacy around their conversation. Tell me, Alaric said finally, about your husband. The request was so unexpected that Ilara found herself answering without her usual guardedness. His name was Matthias, a kind man, skilled with the vines. We married when I was 17, a good match by village standards, though not a love match at first. Her fingers twisted absently in her lap. That came later, slowly, like spring after a harsh winter. You grew to love him then, deeply. He never blamed me for the children that didn't come, though others did. He defended me against the whispers, worked himself to exhaustion expanding the vineyard so we might prosper despite having no sons to inherit. Her voice caught on the memory. The fever took him in 3 days. One moment he was laughing by our hearth, the next burning with sickness, and then gone. I'm sorry, Alaric said, and the simple words carried genuine weight. I lost my queen to childbed fever 5 years ago. The child is well. The confession, for it was a confession rather than a mere statement, hung between them, a shared grief that bridged the chasm of their stations more effectively than any words could have done. The village speaks of little else since your visit, Ilara said, changing the subject when the silence had stretched too long. Galen has been particularly vocal, suggesting improprieties I won't dignify by repeating. Alaric's jaw tightened. He will be dealt with. No. Her response was immediate and firm. That would only confirm the worst suspicions and make my position there impossible. I must live among these people long after your interest in my vineyard has passed. Their eyes met in silent acknowledgement of the truth behind her words, that this unusual connection between them had an expiration date, predetermined by the roles they occupied in the world. What would you have me do then? He asked, and the genuine question, a king seeking her counsel, momentarily robbed Ilara of words. Nothing, she said finally. Let the gossip die its natural death. Without royal attention to feed it, some new scandal will soon replace me in the village's imagination. Alaric studied her, admiration evident in his gaze. Your wisdom would shame half my counsel. He leaned back, a decision seemingly made. Very well. No intervention regarding Galen, though it pains me to let his slander stand. Thank you. The tension in Ilara's shoulders eased slightly. May I ask why you summoned me here today? Surely not just to apologize or discuss village gossip. Honesty deserves honesty in return, Alaric replied after a moment's consideration. I wanted to see you again. To speak with you without pretense or disguise between us. To ensure no lasting harm had come from my selfishness. The simple admission, devoid of royal proclamation or political maneuvering, touched Ilara more deeply than any grand gesture could have done. In that moment she saw clearly the man behind the crown, not Thomas, the fictional steward, nor Alaric, the distant king, but simply a human being reaching across the divide of circumstance toward connection. No lasting harm, she assured him softly. Only confusion, perhaps, and questions without clear answers. He nodded, understanding passing between them without need for elaboration. Whatever this was, this improbable connection between monarch and widow, it existed in a space without precedent or protocol, dangerous yet precious for precisely that reason. It grows late, he observed reluctantly. I've arranged an escort to return you safely to your home. Ilara rose, recognizing the audience had reached its natural conclusion. Thank you for your consideration, Your Majesty. Alaric stood as well, the formal title reinstating the distance their conversation had temporarily bridged. The royal cellars will indeed be purchasing wine from your vineyard, a legitimate transaction conducted through proper channels. Perhaps that will give the gossips something solid to chew upon rather than baseless speculation. The practical solution, protection disguised as patronage, was exactly what she needed, and Ilara felt a surge of gratitude that threatened to overwhelm her composure. You are most generous. Not generous, he corrected gently. Just. As she turned to leave, Ilara carried with her the memory of his eyes. Not the king's evaluating gaze, but the look of a man who, for a brief moment, had found something genuine in a world constructed of artifice and obligation. Rain lashed against the cottage windows, transforming the world outside into a gray blur. Ilara sat by her small hearth, fingers working methodically as she mended a tear in her market apron. 2 weeks had passed since her audience with the king. 2 weeks of carefully maintained distance, of royal wine merchants conducting business with proper documentation, of gradually diminishing whispers in the village square. Life had almost returned to its predictable rhythm, yet something fundamental had shifted within her, like earth that had settled differently after a storm. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Visitors were rare in good weather. In this downpour, they were unheard of. Warily, she set aside her mending and reached for the kitchen knife before approaching the door. Who calls? She asked, one hand on the latch. A message from the castle, mistress. The voice was male, authoritative yet respectful. Ilara opened the door to find a royal guard standing on her threshold, rain streaming from his cloak. Behind him, a covered wagon waited on the muddy path, horses stamping impatiently in the downpour. "The king commands your presence," the guard stated, handing her a sealed parchment bearing the royal insignia. "Immediately." Her fingers trembled slightly as she broke the seal. The message inside was brief, written in a strong hand. "Urgent matter requiring your attendance. Bring nothing. Safety assured." A cold dread pooled in Alara's stomach. What could possibly require her immediate presence at the castle? Had something happened to the king? Or worse, was this some elaborate trap set by court rivals who had learned of their unusual connection? "I'll need a moment to prepare," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. The guard nodded. "Of course, mistress," though His Majesty stressed the urgency of the matter. 5 minutes later, wrapped in her only cloak, woefully inadequate against the driving rain, Alara climbed into the wagon. The guard secured the canvas covering and mounted his horse, leading them away from the cottage and toward the looming silhouette of the castle, barely visible through the storm. By the time they reached the castle gates, Alara's cloak was soaked through despite the wagon's covering. She shivered as she was escorted not through the main entrance but a side door that led directly into the servants' passages. The guard instructed her to wait in a small antechamber, then disappeared down a corridor, his boots leaving wet prints on the stone floor. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Alara paced the confined space, scenarios playing through her mind, each more alarming than the last. When the door finally opened, she turned expectantly, only to find herself facing not the guard who had brought her, but a stern-faced woman in the formal attire of a high-ranking servant. "Follow me," the woman instructed without preamble, quickly and quietly. They traversed a labyrinth of narrow passages, climbing stairs and turning corners until Alara was thoroughly disoriented. The woman moved with practiced efficiency, occasionally glancing back to ensure Alara kept pace. Finally, they reached a door unlike the others, wooden rather than stone, with intricate carvings around its frame. "His Majesty awaits within," the woman said, her expression revealing nothing. "You will speak of this to no one." Before Alara could respond, the door swung open to reveal not a chamber, but another passage, this one carpeted and well lit with wall sconces. At its end stood Edwin, the king's personal attendant whom she recognized from their previous meeting. "This way, mistress," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "The situation requires discretion." "What situation?" Alara found her voice at last. "Why am I here?" Edwin's eyes flickered briefly to the woman behind her, then back. "It is not my place to explain. His Majesty will inform you himself." They continued through another door and into a chamber that took Alara's breath away. Unlike the formal audience room where she had last seen the king, this space was clearly private. A study perhaps, with shelves of leather-bound books lining the walls, comfortable chairs arranged near a massive hearth, and a desk covered in documents and maps. Rain lashed against tall windows that overlooked the castle gardens, now shrouded in evening gloom. And there, standing with his back to her, was Alaric. "Leave us," he said without turning, and Edwin bowed before retreating, closing the door with a soft click that somehow sounded final in the quiet room. When the king finally faced her, Alara was shocked by his appearance. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and a tension she hadn't seen before marked the set of his shoulders. He looked as though he hadn't slept in days. "Forgive the manner of your summons," he began, his voice rougher than she remembered. Circumstances left no room for conventional protocols. "What circumstances?" Alara asked, acutely aware of her dripping cloak and bedraggled appearance in these refined surroundings. "Why am I here?" Instead of answering directly, Alaric crossed to a side table and poured 2 goblets of wine. Her wine, she realized with a start, recognizing the distinctive deep ruby color of her vineyard's best vintage. "There has been a complaint lodged against you," he said, offering her one of the goblets. "A serious one." Alara accepted the wine mechanically, her mind racing. "What complaint?" "Witchcraft." The single word fell between them like a stone into still water, ripples of implication expanding outward. Alara's fingers tightened around the goblet's stem as the room seemed to tilt beneath her feet. "That's absurd," she managed finally. though her voice sounded distant to her own ears. "I'm no witch." "I know that," Alaric replied, gesturing for her to sit in one of the chairs by the fire. "But Galen has gathered 7 villagers who claim otherwise. They've presented their case to the church authorities." Alara sank into the offered chair, the warmth of the hearth doing nothing to dispel the chill that had settled in her bones. 7? Who would? The miller and his wife, the cooper, the blacksmith, the tanner's widow, the candlemaker, and the butcher's son. Alaric recited the names with barely controlled anger, all claiming they've witnessed evidence of unnatural practices. "What evidence?" Ilara's mind whirled. "I've done nothing." "According to their testimony, your vineyard thrives when others fail. Your husband died under mysterious circumstances after failing to produce children. Animals avoid your property. And most damning in their eyes, you've somehow gained the favor of the crown, despite being a common widow with no family connections." The cruel absurdity of it all struck her like a physical blow. Everything that had sustained her through years of struggle, her diligent care of the vines, her perseverance after Matthias's death, twisted into evidence of something sinister. "This is Galen's revenge," she whispered, "for the royal patronage, for refusing to sell him my land." "Without question," Alaric agreed, his voice tight with suppressed fury. "But the charges have been formally registered with the bishop. An investigation is required by law." The implications crashed over Alara in waves. Witch trials were rare but devastating when they occurred. Even if eventually cleared, the accused rarely recovered their reputation or livelihood. Many didn't survive the interrogation methods employed to extract confessions. "What happens now?" she asked, struggling to keep her voice steady. Alaric set down his untouched wine and knelt before her chair, a gesture so unexpected that Alara nearly flinched. "Listen carefully. Church investigators will arrive tomorrow. You won't be there to meet them. You want me to run?" The thought of abandoning her vineyard, Matthias's legacy, her only home, was almost as terrifying as the charges themselves. "No." He took her free hand in both of his, the contact sending a jolt through her despite the circumstances. "I want you to stay here, protected within the castle, while I resolve this matter." "Here?" Alara glanced around the obviously private chamber. "Where exactly?" "These are my personal quarters. There are adjoining rooms where you'll be safe and comfortable. No one will think to look for you here, and those who know of your presence are absolutely loyal." The impropriety of the arrangement struck Alara with fresh horror. "You can't possibly. The scandal would be temporary accommodations only," he assured her quickly, "and completely secret. Meanwhile, I'll deal with Galen and his false witnesses." "How? Even the king can't simply dismiss charges of witchcraft." The church answers to God, but its officials are men who answer to political realities," Alaric interrupted, a hardness entering his voice that reminded Alara he was not just the man who had bought her grapes in the marketplace, but a monarch who commanded armies. "Trust me." Trust. Such a simple word for such an enormous request. Alara looked down at their joined hands, his bearing the signet ring of royal authority, hers calloused and stained from years of working the vines. Everything about this situation defied reason, protocol, prudence. "Why?" she asked finally, meeting his gaze directly. "Why risk your reputation, your position, for a vineyard widow you barely know?" Something shifted in his expression, vulnerability breaking through the mask of royal composure. "Because in a lifetime of people telling me what they think I want to hear, you've shown me nothing but truth. Because you saw me as a man before you knew me as a king. Because..." He stopped, seeming to reconsider his words. "Because justice matters more than convenience." The incomplete thought hung between them, heavy with unspoken possibilities. Alara sensed there was more he had intended to say, but the moment passed as he released her hand and rose to his feet. "Will you stay?" he asked, and though his tone remained measured, she heard the tension underlying the question. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky, as if nature itself were participating in the drama unfolding within these walls. Alara thought of her cottage, standing empty in the storm, of the vineyard her husband had loved, of the village that had tolerated her at best, vilified her at worst. She thought of what awaited her if she returned. Accusation, humiliation, perhaps worse. And she thought of the man standing before her, offering protection at considerable risk to himself, for reasons neither of them fully articulated. "Yes," she said finally, "I'll stay." Relief washed visibly across Alaric's features. "Good. Edwin will show you to your chambers and see that you have everything you need. Rest assured, this situation is temporary. Once Galen and his conspirators are dealt with, you'll return to your home safely." As if summoned by his name, Edwin appeared at the door, his timing so perfect that Alara wondered if he had been listening all along. "This way, mistress," he said with a small bow. Before following, Alara turned back to Alaric, a question she couldn't suppress rising to her lips. "What if you can't resolve this? What if the church insists on pursuing the charges?" The king's expression hardened, a glimpse of the power that typically remained veiled behind diplomatic courtesy. "Then they will discover that while the church may answer to God, this kingdom answers to me." As Edwin led her away through another hidden passage, Alara felt as though she had crossed some invisible threshold, from one life into another, from a world she understood into one governed by rules and powers beyond her comprehension. Whether she would ever find her way back remained to be seen. Dawn broke hesitantly over the castle, pale light filtering through leaded glass windows into chambers Alara still couldn't believe she occupied. The bed where she had spent a restless night was larger than the entire sleeping area of her cottage, its linens finer than any fabric she had ever touched. A fire burned steadily in the hearth despite the early hour, tended by servants who appeared and disappeared with ghost-like efficiency, acknowledging her presence with only the slightest nods. 3 days had passed since her arrival, 3 days of whispered conversations between Edwin and the king outside her door, 3 days of meals delivered on silver trays, 3 days of pacing the confines of her gilded cage, wondering what was happening in the village, in her vineyard, in the world beyond these stone walls. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Before she could respond, the door opened to reveal a young woman carrying fresh towels and a pitcher of steaming water. "Good morning, mistress," the servant said, her eyes carefully averted as she placed her burdens on a side table. "His Majesty requests your presence in his study when you've refreshed yourself. I'm to help you dress." Alara blinked in surprise. This was new, both the summons and the offered assistance. "I can dress myself. I've managed it for 25 years without help." The girl's expression flickered briefly with something like amusement before resuming its practiced neutrality. "Of course, mistress, but His Majesty has provided—" She gestured toward a garment laid across a chair that Alara hadn't noticed before. A dress of deep blue wool, simple in design, but of a quality that made her homespun clothing look like little more than rags. "I can't accept this," Alara said automatically, even as her fingers reached out to touch the fabric, luxuriating in its softness. "His Majesty insists," the girl replied, a hint of urgency entering her voice. "There are matters requiring immediate attention. Important visitors have arrived." Something in the servant's tone sent a shiver of apprehension down Alara's spine. "What visitors?" "It's not my place to say, mistress." The practiced evasion told Alara more than any direct answer could have. The church investigators had come then. 20 minutes later, dressed in the new gown that fit her frame with suspicious perfection, Alara followed another servant through the now familiar hidden passage that connected her chambers to the king's private study. Each step seemed to require more effort than the last, dread building in her chest. The study door opened to reveal a scene she hadn't expected. Rather than the solemn-faced church officials she had feared, the room contained only Alaric and Edwin, both bent over documents spread across the massive oak desk. The king looked up as she entered, and something in his expression, relief mingled with something harder to define, made her breath catch. "Leave us," he commanded Edwin, who bowed and exited through a side door Alara hadn't noticed during her previous visit. Alone with the king, Alara found herself suddenly conscious of the fine dress she wore, of how it must appear. A common widow in clothing befitting a lady, standing in the private chambers of an unmarried monarch. She clasped her hands before her to stop their trembling. "You look troubled," Alaric observed, coming around the desk to stand before her. "I was told visitors had arrived. I assumed. The bishop's investigators, yes." He gestured for her to sit, taking the chair opposite. "They're being kept waiting in the formal audience chamber while I attend to urgent matters of state." Despite her anxiety, Ilara couldn't suppress a small smile at his obvious satisfaction with this arrangement. "How long can you make them wait?" "As long as necessary." His confidence was absolute, reminding her again of the power he wielded. "But events are moving quickly now. I need to explain what happens next." Something in his tone, a curious mixture of determination and regret, caused Ilara's smile to fade. "What have you done?" Instead of answering directly, Alaric reached for a document on a nearby table and handed it to her. The parchment bore official seals and signatures, the formal language nearly impenetrable to her limited reading skills. "What is this?" she asked, struggling to decipher the flowing script. "A royal decree establishing a new position, Master of the Royal Vineyards, responsible for overseeing wine production for the crown." His eyes held hers steadily. "The position comes with land, a modest stipend, and most importantly, royal protection." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're offering me a position at court?" "I'm offering you a way out," he corrected gently. "A legitimate reason for royal patronage that even the church cannot question without directly challenging the crown." Ilara stared at the document, its implications staggering. "This would mean leaving my home, my vineyard. Your vineyard would remain yours, though you would oversee others as well. As for your cottage," he hesitated, "it might be safer to establish new residents closer to the castle, at least until memories of these accusations fade." The practical solution he offered was elegant in its simplicity. With an official position and royal protection, the witchcraft accusations would lose their potency. No one would dare pursue charges against a crown appointee without overwhelming evidence, which they did not have. Yet something about the arrangement felt wrong, a solution that solved the immediate danger while creating new complications she could scarcely imagine. "And Galen?" she asked. "His conspirators?" A hardness entered Alaric's eyes. "The merchant's past tax payments are being reviewed with particular attention to discrepancies. The others are being reminded of royal authority in ways specific to their circumstances." Ilara had no doubt that these reminders were effectively silencing her accusers, yet the victory felt hollow. "So instead of being the widow suspected of witchcraft, I'll be the commoner who somehow secured royal favor through means everyone will speculate about behind their hands." "People always talk," Alaric replied, though she saw her words had struck home. "The difference is whether their talk can harm you." A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Outside, clouds gathered again, dimming the morning light that had briefly brightened the chamber. "There's something you're not telling me," Ilara said finally, studying his face. "What happens when I sign this?" Alaric rose, moving to the window to gaze out at the gathering storm. When he spoke, his voice carried a resignation that chilled her more than any display of anger could have done. "The bishop didn't send junior investigators. He came himself, along with his full retinue." He turned to face her. "Not because of witchcraft accusations against a village widow, but because rumors have reached Rome about a king who may be bewitched." The implication struck Ilara like a physical blow. "They think I've enchanted you? They think something has affected my judgment." "A king who disguises himself to visit the marketplace, who personally calls on a common vineyard, who shows unusual interest in a woman with no family connections or particular beauty by court standards." His smile was bitter. "The church sees the devil's work in what they cannot understand. And this position, this decree, is meant to explain your interest in rational terms." "Exactly." He returned to his chair, leaning forward earnestly. "Your vineyard produces exceptional wine. The crown recognizes quality and rewards skill. Everything follows natural order. No witchcraft, no impropriety, just sound governance." Ilara understood now why the dress had appeared, why she had been summoned so formally. She wasn't just signing a decree. She was stepping into a role crafted to protect them both from something far more dangerous than village gossip. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "Then I cannot protect you." The stark truth hung between them. "The bishop will demand you be turned over for questioning. I could delay, but eventually—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew what happened to women accused of witchcraft, especially those without powerful protectors. "So my choices are to accept a position I never sought, leaving behind the life I've built, or face torture and likely execution for crimes I didn't commit." Ilara couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "I wish there were another way." And she believed him. The regret in his eyes was too genuine to doubt. "But we are both caught in circumstances neither of us created." Another silence fell, broken only by the distant sound of raindrops beginning to strike the windows. Ilara thought of her vineyard, of the small cottage that had been her home since marriage, of Matthias and the life they had built together. She thought of the village that had never truly accepted her, even before these accusations. And she thought of the man sitting before her, a king who had risked his reputation to protect a woman who, by all rational measures, should mean nothing to him. "Why?" she asked finally, the question that had haunted her since that first day in the marketplace. "Of all the suffering in your kingdom, why did mine move you to action?" Alaric's expression shifted, vulnerability breaking through the careful mask of kingship. "Because when I stood at your stall, tasting grapes that had known your care, I saw not just a vendor, not just a widow, but a soul that refused to be diminished by circumstance. Because in your eyes I glimpsed recognition, not of my rank, but of my humanity." He paused, searching for words. "Because in a life surrounded by performance and calculation, you offered something genuine." The raw honesty of his answer touched something deep within Ilara, a recognition that whatever had drawn them together transcended the boundaries of their stations. Not love, that would be too simple a name for this complex connection, but something equally powerful: understanding. "I'll sign," she said at last, reaching for the quill beside the document. "Not because I fear what awaits if I refuse, but because you've shown me the same recognition you describe. You saw me when others looked through me." As she placed her mark on the parchment, a simple E that transformed her life with a single stroke, Ilara felt as though she stood at a crossroads, multiple futures branching from this moment. What lay ahead was uncertain, fraught with complications neither of them could fully anticipate. Yet one thing was clear: the path behind her was forever closed. "What happens now?" she asked, setting down the quill. "Now," Alaric said, rising with renewed purpose, "we face the bishop together." The great hall fell silent as Ilara entered beside the king. Hundreds of candles illuminated the vast space, their light reflecting off polished armor and jeweled adornments worn by the assembled court. Nobles who had been engaged in hushed conversations moments before now stared openly, their expressions ranging from curiosity to undisguised disdain. At the far end of the hall, seated in a chair almost as ornate as the throne itself, waited Bishop Aldrich, a corpulent man whose physical size was matched only by his ecclesiastical authority. Ilara kept her eyes forward, focusing on matching Alaric's measured pace. The blue dress, which had seemed so fine in the privacy of her chambers, now felt woefully inadequate among the silks and brocades surrounding her. Yet she forced her shoulders back, channeling the same quiet dignity that had sustained her through years of village whispers and isolation. Whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine not just her fate, but the course of her entire future. "Your Eminence," Alaric addressed the bishop with perfect courtesy, though Ilara detected the barest edge beneath his words. "Thank you for your patience while I attended to urgent matters of state." The bishop inclined his head slightly, jowls quivering with the movement. "The Church understands the burdens of rulership, Your Majesty." His small eyes shifted to Ilara, narrowing almost imperceptibly, though some matters perhaps demand more immediate attention than others. A current of tension rippled through the hall. The double meaning in the bishop's words was impossible to miss, a veiled reference to the rumors that had brought him to court. "Indeed," Alaric agreed smoothly. which is why I've spent the morning finalizing an appointment of considerable importance to the crown." He gestured for Edwin, who stepped forward bearing the signed decree on a velvet cushion. "May I present Mistress Elara, newly appointed Master of the Royal Vineyards?" Murmurs swept through the assembled courtiers. The bishop's face remained impassive, though a flush crept up from beneath his clerical collar. "A position created only this morning, I understand," he remarked, making no move to acknowledge the document. "Most convenient timing." "On the contrary," Alaric countered, his voice carrying effortlessly through the hall. "The quality of Mistress Elara's vineyard first came to my attention months ago. The crown has been purchasing her wine since early summer, as royal accounts will verify. The formalization of our arrangement was delayed only by administrative matters." Elara marveled at how easily the partial truth flowed from him, facts rearranged to create a narrative that, while not entirely false, obscured the more complicated reality of their connection. "I see." The bishop drummed his fingers against the arm of his chair. "And this appointment necessitates her presence at court? A most unusual arrangement for a widow of common birth." The hesitation before widow carried its own accusation, a subtle questioning of her status, her morality, her place in the carefully ordered world the Church helped maintain. "The position requires close consultation on matters of cultivation and cellaring," Alaric replied. "Court accommodations are standard for royal appointments of this nature." A tense silence followed, broken only by the distant sound of rain against the high windows. Elara felt the weight of hundreds of stares, the collective judgment of people who had never tasted struggle or uncertainty. For a moment, she was transported back to the marketplace, to Galen's public humiliation, to the feeling of being utterly alone among a crowd. "Your Eminence," she spoke suddenly, her voice quieter than the king's but steady. "May I address the true purpose of your visit?" Alaric turned to her, surprise briefly visible in his eyes before his expression smoothed. The bishop raised an eyebrow, clearly taken aback by her directness. "You presume much, woman," he said, the honorific absent from his address. "I presume only what is evident," Elara replied, forcing herself to meet his gaze. "You have not traveled from the cathedral with your full retinue to witness a minor royal appointment. You have come because accusations were made against me. False accusations that somehow became significant enough to warrant your personal attention." A hush fell over the hall, the tension almost palpable as courtiers held their breath, watching the unprecedented scene unfold. A commoner, challenging the bishop directly in open court. "Mistress Elara," Alaric began, a warning note in his voice, but she continued. "I am no witch, your Eminence. I am a widow who tends her vines, who produces wine from the same land my husband's family cultivated for generations. If my harvest is exceptional, it comes from knowledge passed down through the years and labor that begins before dawn and ends after sunset, not from any unholy alliance." The bishop studied her, his expression unreadable. Strong words from a woman whose sudden rise has been remarkable, to say the least. "There is nothing remarkable about hard work being recognized," she countered, acutely aware of how far beyond propriety she had ventured. "What is remarkable is how quickly envy transforms into accusation, and how accusations against a defenseless woman are granted more credence than simple truth." A muscle twitched in the bishop's jaw. "The Church takes all accusations of witchcraft seriously, regardless of station. 7 witnesses have testified. 7 witnesses orchestrated by a merchant who has repeatedly tried to force the sale of my land," Elara interrupted, her fear giving way to a righteous anger that surprised even her. 7 people who have shunned me since my husband's death, who resent that I've managed without their help or approval." Alaric stepped forward, reclaiming control of the increasingly dangerous exchange. "Your Eminence, I've investigated these claims personally. They are without merit, driven by petty grievances and manipulated by the merchant Galen, whose own dealings have proven questionable under scrutiny." The bishop's eyes narrowed further. "The king himself investigated accusations against a common vineyard keeper? How attentive." The implication hung in the air, the very heart of the rumors that had brought him to court, that Alaric's interest in Elara was unnatural, inappropriate, perhaps influenced by darker forces. A king who ignores injustice among his subjects invites God's judgment upon his reign, Alaric replied, an edge of steel entering his voice. Would you have me turn blind eyes and deaf ears to false accusations, especially when they touch upon matters within my personal knowledge? For several tense heartbeats, the two men, secular and ecclesiastical powers incarnate, measured each other in silence. Ilara stood between them, physically present yet metaphorically caught in the ancient struggle between church and crown. Finally, the bishop shifted his substantial weight, adjusting the heavy gold cross that hung around his neck. The church respects the crown's authority in matters of royal appointment, he conceded, though his tone suggested the concession was temporary at best. However, the accusations of witchcraft remain a spiritual concern that cannot be dismissed solely by royal decree. Of course, Alaric agreed, with a diplomacy that belied the tension Ilara sensed beneath his calm exterior. I propose a resolution that honors both crown and church authority. Let Mistress Ilara serve in her appointed position under the observation of your chosen representative. If after 6 months no evidence of unnatural practices has been found, the accusations will be formally dismissed. The bishop considered this compromise, his shrewd eyes calculating political advantages and potential face-saving outcomes. 1 year, he countered, with quarterly reports to my office. Agreed, Alaric said before Ilara could react. And the accusers will be required to make formal apologies in the village square, acknowledging their claims were unsubstantiated. After another moment of consideration, the bishop nodded. So be it. Let it be recorded that the church and crown stand united in vigilance against evil while protecting the innocent from false witness. The careful phrasing allowed him to retreat without admitting error, a political solution to what had never truly been a spiritual question. As the formal proceedings concluded and the court began to disperse, Ilara felt a curious lightness replace the dread that had weighed upon her for days. The danger had not passed entirely. She would live under scrutiny for a year, her every action potentially interpreted as evidence against her. But the immediate threat of arrest and interrogation had been averted. You took a tremendous risk, Alaric murmured as they exited the hall, courtiers parting before them like water around stones. Addressing the bishop directly was unexpected. I've spent my life being spoken about rather than spoken to, Ilara replied quietly. I couldn't bear it happening again, not with my life at stake. Something like admiration flickered in his eyes. Few in that hall, noble-born or otherwise, would have shown such courage. Before she could respond, Edwin appeared at the king's side, his expression urgent. Your Majesty, the northern emissaries have arrived ahead of schedule. They await you in the diplomatic chamber. Alaric nodded, the demands of rulership reasserting themselves. I must attend to this. Edwin will escort you to your new quarters, not the hidden chambers, but proper apartments befitting your position. He hesitated, seemingly on the verge of saying more, then simply added, We will speak later. As Ilara followed Edwin through corridors she had never seen before, past servants who now bowed respectfully at her approach, the full impact of what had transpired began to settle upon her. In the span of a few short weeks, she had gone from anonymous widow to the center of a controversy that had brought the bishop himself to court. She had gained a position she never sought, protection she desperately needed, and a future entirely different from anything she could have imagined. Her vineyard would continue, but at a distance, managed perhaps by hired hands rather than her own calloused fingers. The cottage where she had loved and lost Matthias would stand empty, or pass to new occupants who would never know the tears that had soaked into its wooden floors, and she herself would remain in this world of stone and politics, of carefully chosen words and calculated gestures, connected to the king by a bond neither of them fully understood nor could safely acknowledge. As Edwin opened the door to what would be her new home, a suite of rooms larger than her entire cottage, furnished with simple elegance, Ilara realized that both she and Alaric had sacrificed something precious in the great hall. He had compromised his authority by negotiating with the church over a matter that should have been solely his to decide. She had surrendered the independence that had defined her existence since Matthias's death. Yet standing in the last light of day streaming through windows that overlooked not vineyards but castle gardens, Ilara felt not loss but transformation. Like the grapes she had tended so carefully, she too had been harvested, pressed, transformed into something different but not lesser. "The king asked me to tell you," Edwin said as he prepared to leave her to her new surroundings, "that your vineyard will always remain yours, regardless of your position here. He has arranged for trusted workers to maintain it in your absence, under your direction whenever you wish to provide it." The thoughtfulness of this provision, this recognition of what truly mattered to her, brought unexpected tears to Ilara's eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. Left alone, she crossed to the window and gazed out at the kingdom that stretched beyond the castle walls. Somewhere out there, her vines still grew, reaching toward the sun as they had for generations. They would continue without her daily care, just as she would continue without their familiar presence. The future stretched before her, uncertain, but somehow full of possibility. Not the future she had planned, but perhaps the one she needed. One where being seen, truly seen, had proven more powerful than remaining safely invisible. In a world that constantly judges us by our station, our wealth, or our connections, how often do we truly see another person? The king found himself transformed not by Ilara's grapes, but by her honesty, by eyes that reflected back his humanity rather than his crown. What would you sacrifice to be truly seen, rather than merely observed? How far would you go to protect someone who offered you this rare gift? The boundary between power and vulnerability is thinner than we imagine. Ilara's strength came not from royal authority or inherited privilege, but from the quiet dignity of a soul that refused to be diminished by circumstance. Sometimes the most profound connections form across the widest divides, teaching us that true worth has nothing to do with titles or possessions, but with the courage to remain authentic when the world demands performance. If this story touched your heart, remember that we all wear disguises of some kind. Perhaps today is the day to set yours aside, even briefly, and allow yourself to be genuinely seen. Share this story with someone who might need this reminder, and don't forget to subscribe for more tales that illuminate the hidden chambers of the human heart. Your support allows these stories to reach others who, like the king and Ilara, are searching for authenticity in a world of carefully crafted appearances.